I'm here with Eleanor Goldfield. I met Eleanor several years ago with Move to Amend, and I was very impressed. You know, when we see young people taking control, there's nothing like that happening, and that is what we have with Eleanor Goldfield. She is an activist, a poet, a writer, a journalist, a singer, and if you ever see her in her band, you see how she looks right now. She can also do the band thing very well. But anyhow, Eleanor Goldfield, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well. It's great to be back with you, Egberto.
Well, look, let me ask you a few questions. We are in some a crazy time right now. So, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself to remind some of our audience who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a creative activist and a journalist. I have a show that airs every week on Free Speech TV called Act Out, and you can find that at freespeech.org. And basically, it's a show that tries to show people what's going on the front lines of these movements, to plug people into to existing fights and builds to create the world that we want to live in, and to let them know what the real news is, the stuff that corporate media will never actually bring us, and that they censor consistently. So that's the show, and then I do community organizing on the DC level, and write for several different outlets, both in the United States and also in Sweden. I'm half Swedish.
Now, tell us a little bit about the kind of writings that you do. I've actually blogged some of the stuff that you've written, but tell us a little bit about what you cover.
Well, name a topic. I consider myself a bit of an activist nomad, and I talk a lot about, when I do activist trainings and things like that, I talk about how interconnected our issues are. I think one of the problems that the left has is that we silo our issues, right? We're like, oh, we're the healthcare movement, and we're the money out of politics movement, and we're Black Lives Matter, and we're the women's rights movement. But these are all the same thing. They all exist under the larger systemic problem that affects all of these issues equally. So we have to come together and work together outside of our silo issues. And so that's one of the things that I do, and that's part of why I consider myself an activist nomad, and go to a variety of different issues depending on the time and place. So one of my most recent articles that I wrote was about immigration, and comparing Sweden to the United States. Also done a lot of work on the Medicare for All fight, and the issue of healthcare being a human right. So yeah, name an issue, and and I'm happy to cover it.
Well, I'm actually glad that you said that, because that's exactly what we have to do on the left side of the equation if we are to really make progress. Those silos are currently killing the movement, and unless we get them together and unite them, it's going to stay that way. And what I find is, and this is why I really enjoy. I like to say hanging more with the younger folks, the millennials, the Gen Zs, and so forth. And the reason why is that you guys see the common purpose. And I don't know if it has to do with, let's say, the older Gen Xers and the baby boomers taking it all. Do you feel that sort of concern that, well, look at what you have done to the economy thus far, so you guys have nothing to lose?
I mean, I think the blame game is pointless, because I
Okay.
think it's because, look, I mean, I know people that are far older than me that have spent their entire lives on the front lines of the civil rights movement, of the climate movement. So I think in every generation there are those who fight, there are those who are apathetic. I think that you can look at the trajectory of culture and say that, yeah, people during the 50s and 60s were much more like, oh, whatever, let's,
Mm-hmm.
um, like towards the middle of the 60s, people really got, but there were still people that were apathetic, right? And I think that
Mm-hmm.
that's the problem in every generation. So to me, it's not a matter of, look what you've done to us. It's just a
Mm-hmm.
matter of, yeah, I mean, my parents had less cares when they were young, but that's not necessarily their fault. I think the bigger problem that we have to look at now, rather than saying you put us here, is to look up at the elite and say you put us here. It's not a generational thing; it's a class thing.
Mm-hmm.
And even when my parents were young, there was still a class thing. This hierarchical capitalist system goes back far beyond the previous generation. So I think it's much more important to look at that and say, okay, well, what do we do now as we see the fall of of this system and this end game of climate change. What are we going to do about it, as opposed to throwing stones at each other, which is also something that the left is really good at.
Mm-hmm.
There's a saying that when the left has a meeting, we all sit in a circle to organize. Unfortunately, that's also how we do a firing squad.
No, I mean, believe it or not, I speak to quite a few younger folks, and you are one of the first that is looking at it from solely from that point of view. Let's forget about any sort of blame, or let's forget about those sort of issues. So I want to take you back there a bit, and let me tell you why I want to take you there a bit. Let's look at 1980. Okay, don't you think that taxation and the way that we handle what the government did for people changed dramatically in the 80s? And don't you think that that we have to examine that causality, and that causality does have aging in there?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think that. I think if you look at the rise of neoliberalism and the restructuring of our entire economic and social justice system, yeah, absolutely. And I think that, and I misspoke. I said the 50s and 60s people were kind of whatever, but
Right.
that was actually the later 70s and 80s, and certainly the 90s. And so I think that you definitely have to take that into consideration and see. One of the things that I think is interesting is, okay, so why did people unplug?
Mm-hmm.
Why? And I think a lot of that was with the Vietnam War and the assassination of people like Martin Luther King Jr. And people felt that their hope had literally been murdered.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why a lot of people unplugged, and a lot of people felt burnt out and that they just couldn't fight anymore. And of course, this is when you see the rise of neoliberalism and you see the rise of things like the Powell Memo and a restructuring of a
Exactly.
more corporatized system that is friendly, and the activist Supreme Court that takes the side of corporations and profit over people. And of course, you could say the same thing about even back in 2003. Where was the anti-war movement? Why couldn't we rise uh, to the sound of that Vietnam era anti-war movement with the Iraq War? Is it that we just had a totally different system that we were going up against? I mean, the system had changed, but so I think that you definitely have to look at the how the structure has changed. But overall, I think that one of the most important things is to see how we've adapted. And I talk about this a lot too, that human adaptability is what has gotten us this far, but now
Mm-hmm.
it's killing us, ironically.
Wait,
Uh,
explain that. I don't quite follow that. Tell me a little bit more.
Yeah, so if you think evolutionarily speaking, right, our
Mm-hmm.
ability to adapt to extreme situations is why humans have progressed. And yet now that adaptability has made us the frog in the boiling water. We've adapted
Oh,
to
I got
rising
you. Yeah.
income inequality. We've adapted to no health care. We've adapted to longer working hours. We've adapted to perpetual war. We've adapted to the destruction of our environment. So this is the reality of the situation. And again, I think that you can definitely look back at history and see specific points where this really started to happen, like the 1980s. But I think overall, my focus now is, okay, well, how do I pull people out of that adaptability? How do I get people out of that comfort zone before they're incredibly wrenched out of that comfort zone by rising sea waters or by the next financial crash or what have you?
I love that analogy with the boiling water and the frog. I mean, the frog not realizing the water is getting hot until it's boiled. I first heard that story with an activist in Detroit when we went out there for I think it was Netroots Nation or one of those. That is so true what you're saying there. Okay, now state of the country. Tell me as you see it. Where are we now at point zero? Where are we right now?
I saw a really good tweet that basically said it's an amazing time to be alive because it's like the fall of the Roman Empire, but with Wi-Fi. And that's kind of how I feel.
Okay.
Because the U.S. is an empire. We've got 1,000 military bases around the world. Our military is stationed in active roles in 40% of the countries around the world. We are an empire.
Mm-hmm.
Not least of all looking at what we're trying to do in Venezuela. So I think that we are definitely an empire, and the question is, how is this empire going to fall? Of course, I live in hope, and I hope that it's not incredibly violent. But that has to do with how the people mobilize. And I think that right now the state is that, people younger than me are looking at their futures and they're not seeing anything promising. And so they're mobilizing. And I think that this is a very pivotal moment. And I think we could either go in the direction where we see the continuous rise of the far right. And I don't use the word fascism lightly, but I think that that's really what we're looking at. Or we go in the direction where people take control of our power, because people do have the power. And that's not something that I use as a cliche, trope. It's true, because if we just decided tomorrow that we're not going to go to work, or that we're not going to go to school, or what have you, the economy would grind to a halt. The
Right.
entire system would break down. So I think that if we can continue down this road of recognizing our power and mobilizing on that, then I think that state of the union, so to speak, looks really quite bright. Then on the other side, there's the not so bright direction. And I don't see a third direction, to be honest. I think capitalism, the fall of capitalism will either kill us or we kill the fall of capitalism. I really only see those two options on the
I
table.
agree wholeheartedly. It's amazing that you mentioned about what the young people see, and that is something that I've been attempting to preach for a long time to, especially those folks that are talking about moderation. Let's be moderate. Let's be moderate. What I try to tell them is that, look, I am from Central America. I'm from a place where people know what it means to, we don't really have an option.
Mhm.
And not only we don't have an option, what do we have to lose? And when you don't have anything to lose, you don't have anything to lose. And that is where a whole lot of the younger folks are. They're in a whole lot of student debt. They will never buy a home. They will never buy a car, and they're going to live at home. And their parents mortgaged their homes to send them to school. And now nobody has anything. How do we get out of that? And but anyhow, you actually you brought up Venezuela. Interestingly, I interviewed the the ambassador to Colombia last week, who is attempting to convince Americans that we really need to go into Venezuela. And in fact, guess what he's saying? He's saying that El Grupo de Lima is a group of Latin American countries, including the country of my origin, that got together completely without the United States to go ahead and try to oust Nicolas Maduro. Interestingly, guess what he said? I asked him because he was interviewed by NPR, or mainstream media. He was interviewed by NPR, and NPR never asked him the question. They just accepted that he said it was a completely Latin American solution. So I asked him, by the way, have that group met with Elliot Abrams? What do you think his answer was?
Well, it depends on whether he answered truthfully or not.
He answered truthfully. I mean, we were so comfortable. He answered just about everything truthfully. Yes,
Yeah, well, of
he,
course.
he met with Elliot Abrams. And what does that mean to you?
Well, Elliot Abrams is a psychopathic war criminal. So, and I think you only need to look so far as John Kiriakou pointed out that
Yes,
Bolsonaro's first stop after he got off the plane was to go to Langley, CIA headquarters. Now, why would the head of state for Brazil go to CIA headquarters where they admitted that they just openly talked about toppling Maduro? And why is Colombia so interested in Venezuelan human rights violations when Colombia has excessive human rights violations going on in their own country constantly that predominantly affect indigenous and Afro-Colombian residents?
exactly. So, I mean, it's all cabal, it's all intertwined. Now, let's move this. I brought that up because you brought up Venezuela, and I thought, wow, that was an interesting segue. But anyhow, going back to our local our local issues, Trump. Before I go to tell me a little bit about where does this stuff end? I just did a little video after I watched all the news media concentrate themselves today on his tweets over the weekend and how he's bastardizing McCain. And I'm like, don't you guys see the diversion? that is not what it's all about. What are your thoughts on that? I'm curious if you came out in the same place I did.
So I actively ignore most of what Trump says.
Right. Good.
Because like you said, it's a diversion. It totally is. It's that ADD look here, shiny, shiny, and mainstream media just eats it up. And
Right.
meanwhile, it doesn't comment on things like what's really going on in Venezuela or Yemen or what's going on even in the United States. You know, the fact that Flint still doesn't have clean water,
Right.
or the fact that these places that have been devastated by hurricanes, like North Carolina or Houston, or the fires in California, that these places haven't gotten any federal aid. There's no commentary on this. There's only the commentary that Trump said something mean about a dead guy. Who cares? Who cares? It's not important. And I think this is the problem. This is what it's a big problem in the U.S. One of the biggest roadblocks that I see to actually realizing a significant change is media literacy. You know, I'm sure that if people were to watch your show, a lot of people would say, "Wait, what? I didn't know that."
Exactly.
Really, because the corporatized media, their whole objective is to keep a uninformed populace that just goes with the flow. And as they say, only dead fish go with the flow. So, you know, I think that that's very, very indicative of where, unfortunately, a lot of people are. Interestingly enough, if you look at young people under the age of 35, the majority of them don't go to corporatized news
Me.
for
Right.
their news, which is, I think, another ray of sunshine and hope. Is that people under the age of 35 are watching things like your show and my show and seeing behind the veil of the propaganda. But of course, people outside of that who do watch mainstream media are going to be concerned about what Trump tweeted, and they're going to be concerned about the two-party system, and using the same line like, "Oh, we just have to vote blue no matter who," that sort of tired trope. So that's I think it all comes down in that sense with regards to Trump's tweets. It all comes down to media literacy, really.
Yeah, it is amazing. That is so true. Now, I back in just before the election in New York, where Alexandria Ocasio Cortez won her primary, not her, yeah, her primary. I
Mhm.
interviewed her at Netroots Nation,
Nice.
and interestingly, I found her to be extraordinarily smart. Okay. Now, and let me tell you, I'm not talking about just what we spoke on camera. I found her. She's very young, and I found her to be more, how should I say, more mature for her age when we were off camera talking about these particular issues. I think she was at Stand Rock with. I think you were at Stand Rock yourself, right?
I was not, but I reported on it.
Okay, great. Anyhow, she did all of that and so forth. So I'm interested to say your thoughts on her as a younger person, if it matches mine, and what you think about how she's doing things right now.
Well, yeah, I agree. She's brilliant, and I think one of the things about, because I've also been told by people, wow, you're awfully mature for your age, and my comment was always, well, I have to be.
Exactly.
um, but I think I think she's definitely brilliant, and I think it's a testament to her power and her determination, and also the distrust that people have with the establishment, that she is where she is. I think those two things definitely came together to create the space for her to win. I will say this: I don't agree with her on everything,
Hmm.
but I don't think that you'll ever find a candidate where you're like, wow, you are exactly a carbon copy of my brain. That
Right.
would be weird. I think the whole point of a representative is to have someone that you can push, because
Right.
the whole point of a representative is to represent you. So if you say, I agree with you on this, but I don't agree with you on that, their job is to listen.
Exactly.
Um, in a democracy or a republic or whatever, which we don't have. But I also, and that's the problem. And that's the problem is that
It's true though. I mean, first of all, why the hell do we have an electoral college? And when I complain about it, people talk about, well, we were never a democracy. We were always a representative republic.
but that's
Or
but that's also ridiculous because the electoral college is basically a way to say whatever you just said, we don't agree,
doesn't
so we're
matter.
just gonna erase.
Exactly.
That's the whole point of it. Same
Exactly.
thing. Same thing with the Supreme Court. You don't. I mean, they have no accountability to anybody. So they just say, okay, this is the supreme law of the land, and you're like, but I disagree, and they're like, don't care, we're not accountable to you.
Exactly.
And that's the problem is that, people look at someone like Ocasio-Cortez or Ilhan Omar and they're like, wow, you're our savior. And
Oh
then
no. Yeah.
I'm the rain cloud that's like, hey, we don't have that kind of system. Um, even if Ocasio-Cortez were president, we don't have that kind of system. There is no such thing as a savior in Congress or in the White House. So I think that it's really important that we recognize what these representatives represent, and also that the quote unquote blue wave
Mm-hmm.
of 2018 was a corporate wave. The
Right.
majority of Democrats that won were establishment Dems. The majority of them, for instance, do not support Medicare for all. So I think it's important that we recognize that although we got someone like Ocasio-Cortez in there, it's not at all indicative of enough progress to sit back and say, we're on the right track. If anything, it's to show that disparity, and having her in Congress shows just how far of a gap there is between what the people want and what Congress is doing.
But you know what else? You just said something that's interesting. You said the gap between what the people want and what we have in Congress. And likewise, if you take a look at mainstream media right now, they're trying to convince people that she is too left and that the people don't, in as much as all the things that she's talking about, or many of the things that she's talking about, polls at 70,
Mm-hmm.
80%. But somehow she is the left fringe. Programs like yours, that's the importance of building programs like yours, programs like mine that it's not about just building, it's about we have to get them built.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to get the throughput in as much as I don't know if you've noticed yet, but how much we're being throttled, especially on the left
Oh
side
God,
of
yeah.
we are being throttled to kingdom come right now. So I mean, we have to, I just sent out a mailer recently where I told my people on my list, which is growing pretty large now, that look, remember this, we're going back to the old fashioned way of activism now. Email and direct contact, because what's happening. And then, in saying that, I recall you coming out with, I think, a piece that you did where you actually sent people to a new platform to say, hey, things are going to get here. Why don't you tell, now this message is not for, I mean, this message is for everybody that I want you to talk about, but talk about it mostly from an activist point of view, because we have to sort of help activists as well expand their horizons and how they can move their message, get their message out even further.
Well, I'll start by saying that everyone is an activist if they want to be. I
I like
think
that.
and
I
this is
stand
something
corrected.
this is something that I talk about a lot, is because I think people think of the word activist and they're like, oh, but I don't have the time to spend that much on going to a blockade or a protest. And that's not it. Activism starts with caring, and
Hmm.
then acting on that, whether that be, organizing with your church group on, something like feeding the homeless. Like, it doesn't have to mean that you go do a tree sit for 2 months, right?
Right.
So I think it's important that we all recognize that we're capable and are needed. The second part is that so Facebook has, for those who aren't aware, Facebook has purged a lot of alternative media pages, and for those who are left, like myself, have severely censored. So I get a few messages every week saying, "Oh my gosh, I didn't even know your page still existed.
Right.
I keep having to go back and like it again, or I keep trying to see your posts, but I won't see them." So Facebook is doing a great job of throttling alternative voices because, of course, they're in league with people like the Atlantic Council, who is on the board of their fake news department,
Hmm.
and anything that isn't state condoned is considered fake news or Russian or whatever. So I've also started posting on a platform called Minds, Minds, like mind,
Mm-hmm.
minds.com. And it's an alternative platform that is it's decentralized.
Mm-hmm.
It's non-surveillance and it's open source. And what that means is that anybody can go in there and look at the code. So you can see if there's an algorithm that looks weird, that would for some reason not allow your content to be seen. But also because it's decentralized, there's no central authority that dictates whose content gets seen. And so that's currently a good alternative to Facebook. Of course, it hasn't grown to the size of Facebook, but it already has several million users, and it's a good platform for alternative media outlets to be on. I mean, Mint Press News is on there. I'm on there. Lee Camp is on there. Alternet, Anti-Media being one of the pages that was purged from
Pull
Facebook.
down, yeah. I remember Robert Rodrigo had some issues with that when that happened.
So yeah, I mean it's an important time for people to start looking at alternatives for the big social media networks. And this is not to say delete your Facebook account. I know you want to stay in touch with your niece or whoever on Facebook, but also consider a different platform for your news, because understand that literally like the State Department and folks like the Atlantic Council are dictating what news you see on Facebook.
Now, let me ask you a little bit about Minds.com, because I did create an account a while back, but hadn't followed up with it much. Have you started to see some traffic on the platform pretty much?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely traffic, and people are, it's still getting worked out. But the cool
Mm-hmm.
thing is also that you can, because it's still growing, you have more say. So you
Right.
can actually get in touch with the developers and say, "Hey, I'd like to see this. Like, this is a parameter that I'd be interested in seeing here," and you can network with people easier. And things are basically organized via hashtag. So if you post something on Minds under, say, hashtag news or
Mm-hmm.
hashtag politics, then that's just under that hashtag. It's not sorted under any sort of algorithm. It's just there.
Okay.
So there's definitely some traffic, and there's also, I mean, this could be a whole other, uh,
Section, yeah,
segment,
program.
but
Right.
there's also potential for cryptocurrency
Right.
on Minds as well.
Yeah. Now, before we go, tell me what you think about the current state of the Democratic Party and the current folks that are running. Okay, three, two, one, go.
Um, uh, well, first of all, I'm pretty sure like everyone and their mother is running as the Democrat in 20. I mean, I don't know anyone who's not running. And second of all, I agree with Michelle Alexander, the writer of the author of The New Jim Crow, when she
Hmm.
said it would be easier to just create a new party than trying to reform the Democrats. I trust the Dems about as far as I could throw the lot
Let
of
me
them.
stop you for a second there, because I have of several minds there. I continue to work with the party with the other expectation that somehow uh, we can do better. Now you opened up another door. I was about to cut this short in 2 minutes. Now you're forcing me to ask you another question. Um, right? How in a two-party system? How do you envision getting another party successfully intertwined into the whole thing?
Well, if you look historically, and I definitely recommend having Nick Brana on your
Mm-hmm.
show. I think he'd be great as well. He's the founder of Movement for a People's Party,
Okay.
and was pretty high up in Bernie Sanders' campaign in 2016. Has 10 years experience working with the Democratic Party from the inside.
Mm-hmm.
He's seen how the sausage has been made, so to speak. And if you look historically, when the Republican Party was first formed, it was basically because the Whig Party
Mm-hmm.
fell apart.
Right.
And I think what we're seeing now is the Democratic Party is falling apart. I mean, if you just look at they're absolutely just like desperately flailing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think and people are really over it. If you look at the reality of folks in this country, the majority of Americans are independent.
Yeah, they're unaffiliated. Absolutely.
Yeah. So almost more than Democrats and Republicans combined.
Actually,
So,
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Combined. I thought you were going to say that.
oh
Okay,
yeah,
go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah. So I think that this is a very powerful time to take that energy and what, for instance, what the Movement for the People's Party is doing is taking uh, the the people that the Democrats take for granted. So, for
Mm-hmm.
instance, the labor movement. Union members very often vote Democrat because the Democrats are always talking about wages and always talking, but they do nothing for unions.
Right.
And so and the AFL-CIO actually released a statement at their last national meeting saying that regardless of whether it's Republicans or Democrats, they always go with Wall Street. And that's huge because the AFL-CIO is the biggest
Right.
coalition of unions in the country. So for them to release a statement that says basically screw both of you guys is
Right.
huge. And I think that really shows how workers in this country are feeling. And so I think it's a great time for that party to come in. And the way that would work is really just using the system that we have. You can start a new party. And if you get enough signatures, if you get the signatures of millions of people who are fed up with the Dems, well, then you have yourself a party. And I think that there is definitely reason to believe that some of the more progressive people that are running as Democrats because they see it as their only option would then run in a new party platform.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point because, to put it bluntly, that's where many folk, in fact, many activists like myself who straddle the fence, that's where we are. You know, well, look, Eleanor Goldfield, let me tell you, it's always a pleasure to speak to you. I think this is the third time that we're on because you always bring something new all the time. So before we go, let me tell you, Act Out is one of the better, well done shows. And I carry that sometimes at the liberalnetwork.com and of course at egbertowillies.com. She knows what she is talking about and she goes in depth with what she is doing.
Also
Eleanor,
in debt.
aren't any look, activism is not lucrative, is it?
No, no, it's
It's
not.
not lucrative. And, so we try all kinds of avenues to say, folks, invest in what we're doing because we're saving you.
I
We
know.
are we are the ones that are going to prevent the bloodshed. We are the ones that are going to prevent all of that. Eleanor, tell us a little bit about your show again so that people can get there. What I want to do, and I'm going to put this in the blog as well, I want to throw you all over the place with your show because I love it. I learn from your show,
Thank
and
you.
you're always well done. So give a
Appreciate it.
plug for your show.
Okay, thank you. So my show airs on Free Speech TV. It's also online and on podcast via iTunes and Stitcher and Spotify. And links to all of that you can find on my home website, which is artkillingapathy.com. And you can also get Act Out via Free Speech TV, which is freespeech.org. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have more questions or connect and check out my show and the other creative activism work that I do. And any support and spreading the message is greatly appreciated. And thank you, Egberto, for having me on. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.
Absolutely. Eleanor Goldfield, thank you so kindly for having been with us. And we'll continue to check you out and we'll continue to get all those programs, okay?
Thank you. Likewise. Be well.